The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi everybody, and welcome to another edition of Humanity First. My name is Peter Evers. I'm the host of this show, and as is BAMSI, the agency that I work for. Today, we thought it'd be a really good idea to come off topic from some of the things that we do and work out how as an organization we organize ourselves, how we plan for the future, and how we see what obstacles are in our way and develop a path, a strategy for advancement. This is called strategic planning in the business world, and for-profit world and non-profit world. And it really helps us with our mission, our values, and our vision, and where we want to go as an organization. So we're going to break that down a little bit because it sounds really complicated. And it is in some ways, but Ulea Lago, who is our EVP of Business Strategy Development, is going to come in and she's going to tell us a little bit more about that, break that down, talk about strategy and culture, and how we deal with it in an organization, and we're not alone. Everybody is thinking this way as we go into the future. So stick around. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse, and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi everybody, and welcome to Humanity First. My name is Peter Evers, as I said before, and as I promised in the first section, we have Ulea Lago with us, who has been on the show before, but not in the studio. So Ulea, welcome, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you. This is quite fancy.
It really is, isn't it? And Ulea is our Executive Vice President of Business and Strategy. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and about how the work that you do at BAMSI. Mm-hmm. But I'd really love to have a conversation about strategic planning, because I know we're in the middle of that and you're guiding this. So maybe I'll start with a bit of a provocative statement. I was thinking about this the other day. I think it was Otto von Bismarck back in 1869 said, you know, don't ask about how politics is made. It's a little bit like making sausages. Is there any truth to that in strategic planning?
I don't think it's quite as grisly.
Good.
I've been likening strategic planning to taking a giant ball of string and teasing out all the strands until they're nice and parallel and you can see where they're all going. It's sort of like that in that there's so much going on. BAMSI is so big and complicated and no issue is simple. And it just seems overwhelming. But when you start to do the research and dig down, you can slowly kind of see what's going on with each of those. And if you can pull them out parallel, then this is how we might address all three of these things with one simple, somewhat simple activity.
Yeah, you know, I think about strategic planning and the history of it, and also I hope we'll get to the balanced scorecard and what that means, and some examples of how organizations have not really had a balanced scorecard and ended up in trouble. Yep. But you know, the cynic inside of many people is this just busy work? Why can't you just let me do what I do, because what I do is effective? And I have to say, at various points along my career and in my life, when I've been doing more direct care, I was struck by that. And making the case for a strategic plan begins with defining it, right? So I think what you're talking about is making things understandable so that when you break it down, you can see sort of a direction towards strategic planning. But what is the usefulness of a strategic plan? Let's start there, because maybe some people that are listening haven't heard about it.
Well, I think there are several components to a strategic plan, and I will be the first to say it's not always useful. You have to do it would say the right way, or the way that's right for your organization and you. So people may have experienced a strategic plan that felt like a waste of time, and that version may have been for them, because you're supposed to be getting something out of it. So the first step of strategic planning is really doing what I call an environmental analysis. It's a situational scan. It's looking at what's the state of the state. So you look at your reputation, you look at your metrics, you talk to stakeholders and hear how they're doing, what they're looking for. You do a lot of literary review, looking at trends. You look at survey data from persons served and from staff. You just get a sense of where everything is. How are we doing? And from that, you can pull out your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So that's important because you're taking a snapshot in time of where you are. When you're just head down working, you don't really have the opportunity to think about, well, how are we being perceived? You just think about, I'm doing this work, and the work is good, or the work needs work, whatever. So being able to step back and look at that and then go, okay, where, based on all of this and our mission, where do we want to be? What do we want to accomplish? In our last strategic plan, we said we wanted to be a financially stable, integrated system of care. And to do that, we looked at, we need to become an employer of choice. We saw the vacancies were really impacting us, our quality of care, our ability to deliver services. So we looked at how we can become an employer of choice. That was one of our objectives. And based on all the data, we said we're not going to be able to do this with salary alone. Some organizations, they can just pay more and become an employer of choice because people want the extra money. We can't do that because of how we're funded. So we had to look at other ways to become an employer of choice, and employee engagement is a huge driver of why people come and stay at places. So we focused a lot of our energy and tactics around becoming an employer of choice, engaging our employees, becoming more transparent, more engaging, and we ended up, we've improved retention by, I think, 10 points.
Right.
Which is helping us deliver better services, provide a more financially stable system of care.
Yeah, I mean, so it begins to sort of fall into focus now, because strategic plan, for a lot of people, is like, why are those two, words together? I don't quite understand that. But what you are beginning to define is a purpose for an organization, and a vision of where you want to be in the future, and how everybody in the organization is connected to that. You spoke earlier on about sometimes it can be a waste of time, and I think many people probably feel that because it's been a work within itself, a piece of busy work, perhaps a piece of paper that sits on a shelf maybe for 4 years. How do you bring so your description is great. You identify where you want to be, and then you identify steps to how you want to get there, and then you measure it by goals that are measurable, that are tactile. Okay, you've done it, and it's a really beautiful piece. It's sort of it's a Doric arch. It's wonderful. How do you bring it to life?
So when I started doing strategic planning, we were coming out of an era where a lot of strategic plans were done by the CEO or a small group of leaders, and they kind of say, well, this is where I think we need to be. This is what I think of where we are. These are the things we're going to do. And they'd announce to their staff and say, go, do. Strategic planning, at least in the nonprofit sector that I've been involved in, has really evolved into being a much more collaborative process. So we have a work group that engages people from different parts of the organization, because actually it's funny, they thought I would just provide them with the research. They wouldn't actually have to do anything. I could just provide them with the environmental scan. But as I explained, it's important that they're involved in that, because we need to answer their questions. We need to know what do they want to know in order to decide or figure out where BAMSI should go. What's important to them. So you're starting off with what's important, and what do you want to change? Where do you think there might be issues? So getting people's buy-in on that early on is really important, because if I come in and say, you know what, we're going to fix retention, and people are like, I didn't know that was a problem.
Right. And they're seeing their role in it as well. I mean, I think it's true that whatever happens in any big organization, if you come to your staff and say, this is the way we're doing it, they're not going to feel as if they own that.
No.
And I think it works sometimes. It depends what kind of business you're in. You might be in the for-profit nuts and bolts making arena. But when you're dealing with humans who are dealing with humans' lives, and going back to us being a preferred employer, you have to prove that proposition right to people so that they can see a direct line from the work that they're doing to all of those steps in the strategic plan. If we could just shift to balanced scorecard for a minute, because I think this is really important. So we've got our plan and we understand that we have a direction. How do we make sure that we don't focus too much on one of those values, so that the rest of those values struggle? That's really the effectiveness of actually rolling out a strategic plan, right?
Well, so it's being thoughtful in your approach. I think that's a lot of what strategy can be boiled down, is to be thoughtful in trying to reposition yourself in a way to be successful. How do you want to do that? And so when we think about our position, what we want, we think about it from a bunch of different perspectives. We think about it financially.
Right.
We have to be able to make margin. We need to be able to be financially stable. We think about it in terms of our mission, that we need to be able to serve people. We think about it in terms of our staff, and that we need them to be happy and engaged and to be a preferred employer. And we think about it from the perspective of, where are we going? Everything's changing and evolving. How do we react? How do we respond? How nimble are we? And so those four perspectives really can inform your objectives and how you're moving at it. But it shouldn't be where you stop. You should continue to look at how those four areas are being addressed moving forward, because let's say we really, really, really want to get our financial numbers better. If we focus too much on that and we're not looking at how it's impacting our employees and the metrics around that, we could end up in a really bad spot.
So bring that to life for me, because I think that's a really important thing. As I was listening to you, I was thinking, wow, you have a mission. I think, is it Walmart that their mission is something like, we want to give you a very cheap product that has quality or something?
They want you to have more money in your pocket,
yes,
I think.
That's right,
yes.
yeah. And it's really simple, right? But when you break it down like that, initially you think, oh my goodness, it's not just about one thing. It's like about your staff. It's about how well trained and people are. It is about balancing, your budget, and it's about your external customer. And so bring it to life for me with an example, because strategic plans are not only for nonprofits. No. Their mission statement is very much in the for-profit world. Can you give us an example where really an organization didn't pay attention to those four quadrants?
I would think Boeing is a pretty relevant and recent example, in that they were very focused on the profit motive and improving their bottom line. They didn't pay attention to employee morale, the feedback that employees were giving, or quality. And so those metrics went down. They weren't really valued as equally as the profit motive. Yeah. And then you have a huge incident, which is disastrous for the company.
Yeah. Yeah, they always say that about air flight, right? That it's very safe, but when it's not, it's very dangerous. Yeah. But I think about JetBlue, and JetBlue is a really good example of how it worked, right? Which is exactly the opposite. We're still in the aviation business. Here's an organization that looked at the aviation business that was really, really struggling back in the 90s. Delta and American, Pan Am had already gone, and you were looking at a very, very fed up client group. Travel used to be exotic. Yes. Actually, I'm told that they used to come to your house to pick you up at the beginning of aviation.
Really?
Maybe that was just in Britain. just to encourage people to believe that this very heavy thing could lift off the ground and fly, which I still don't really understand. But JetBlue said, we need to look at this from a different angle. Let's not keep reducing the width of our seats because we want to get more people on board. Let's have the widest seats in the business. Let's make it easier to book onto a flight. Let's make people know through our brand that this is new, this is fresh. And all of a sudden, that profit started coming in because they stood out in a community of people that weren't doing too well. And they did that through a balanced scorecard, right?
Yes, and that ties into one of my other loves at BAMSI is working on branding.
Yeah.
And what's your brand? What's your value proposition? How are you positioning yourself in the market? So we do that with our employees. We've decided we want to position ourselves as a place that is really cares about our employees, embraces diversity, equity, inclusion, cares about your employment and your future growth as an employee. We can't pay top dollar, but we can do these other things for you, and that's what you come to BAMSI for.
That's right. And you begin to separate yourself a little bit out in the marketplace. Does a strategic plan work for all organizations? Okay, that was a lead question. Yeah. So the body of this is that I've heard you say a number of times, and I don't get sick of it, that that culture eats strategy for breakfast, which I love that
Yes.
because you can have all of the strategy in the world, but if you come at this without acknowledging your culture and making sure that the culture of an organization is good, then it's not going to work, right? So how do you bind these things together in terms of growing culture?
I mean, when I look at creating a strategic plan, I look at the culture to some degree. And, if it's a culture that embraces innovation, that informs where you put your metrics. You're like, okay, we can do something completely different here. We can turn on a dime and we can go in another direction, and that's fantastic. If you have a culture that, say, is very data-driven, you need to keep being data-driven in your metrics, in your way of developing your strategy and what that's going to be. Alternatively, if you have an organization that's really focused on storytelling and that's their culture, it's really hard to move them into a data-driven system. And so you have to plan for a longer transition term. You have to figure out how you're going to shift that culture.
Right. But you have to shift the culture before you can be successful.
Or you can decide to set a goal that aligns completely with the culture as it is.
Yeah. Which gets us back to the balanced scorecard, right? Which is if you're not paying attention to all of those realms.
Yep.
And I love the idea about storytelling, because when we're fundraising, let's say in 1990, we pretty much relied on stories, right?
Yep.
And we all had a story in an organization about a kid that finds a stone that's a heart shape or whatever it is. And, the kid says, your organization is my heart. That's lovely and it's important, but also showing that, 50% of the kids that you were dealing with graduated high school and went on to college. That's a much more powerful story.
Impact. People want to know when they're donating that they're making a difference. Yeah. They're not just giving to a nice story. They're giving to something that's actually going to change someone's life. Right. And so if you can show your donors and your funders how you're changing people's life, and a nice story is great, and it brings people in, and you want some of those stories, because at the end of the day, everything is personal. Everyone's individual. Yeah. You want to know you've touched someone. But I also want to know, well, it wasn't a one-off, was it? Right. You've done this for hundreds of people.
Right. One of our kids got into Harvard, right?
Yeah.
Versus 50% of our kids went on to further education.
Exactly.
That's a great story about Harvard, because everybody knows what Harvard is. Isn't it a better story that 50% of your kids...
Yeah.
For example.
Yes, you had one anomaly, and everyone else.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, as we think about this and we think about changing culture, if we think about making sure that we cover all the bases, how in the end do you roll out the strategic plan?
So part of our process and engaging a work group to work with us is inviting them to share some of the ideas as we're developing them. So we will have a retreat where leadership will look at all the research and do our SWOT analysis and come up with our strategic goals, and maybe even in that some of our objectives. And then the work group will go back to their divisions and their people and talk about those objectives and get feedback on, so how do you think we can help BAMSI get there? Those ideas will come back to the group, and we'll start building those into an implementation plan. And then that information will again go back out to the community, the employees, and we'll get feedback on that. And that will help us build kind of our strategy for how we're going to implement.
Yeah, so we're talking about engagement, we're talking about inclusivity, about listening to everybody. It's not that complicated, right?
It's not. You just have to, it can be complicated because you will give out information, and what you get back won't be a simple, yes, let's do it that way.
Right.
So you're going to be constantly pivoting, and you're going to have people who disagree and want to go in a different direction, and maybe don't even agree with a strategic goal.
Right.
And you're going to have to bring them along of, well, this is what the agency decided, so we need to figure out how to all row in the same direction.
Yeah, and we're all individuals and have our own idea about it, which actually makes us stronger, but it makes the process, they always say democracy takes a little bit longer. It's the worst form of government except for every other form of government. And that's absolutely right. And I think that sort of speaks to our values as well.
And democracy isn't unanimous.
That's
Democracy always has people who don't agree. And the work is then bringing them along.
Yeah. Ulea, we have unbelievably run out of time because that seemed like 2 minutes as usual. It's really important to think about how businesses run, and we're not a mom and pop shop, as I think they use that expression in this country, and we've developed a lot, but I think strategy and strategic planning is applicable to anybody who's in the workplace, and thank you so much. You've really described a process which is complicated in a way that helps us understand it. So thank you, and maybe we'll do this again in a few months when we roll out our strategic plan.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.